The 90-year history of Trinity Lutheran Church in Orlando bears evidence of religious devotion and personal dedication on the part of numerous parishioners who perceived the need for spiritual guidance and saw to it that it was provided for generations to come. The beginning, while inspired, was difficult. Services, which started in 1895, were irregular and the congregation quite small. Orlando in those days was nothing more than a sandy palmetto patch. Winter Garden and Gotha were going places, and Orlando was the orphan, but the Spirit of Christ prevailed in the small community. In August 1915, the Reverend George Trapp came as a missionary at large, only to stay 31 years, and witnessed the growth of the church from a small congregation of some 40 souls to a throng that eventually numbered over 1,000. Some of Trinity's oldest parishioners recall that at one time the congregation met in a Jewish synagogue, a Seventh-day Adventist church, and a Unitarian church, only proving that the house of God is largely in the spirit of man. Mr. Carl Kleineck, as Secretary Pro Tem, worked hard with Pastor Trapp in those days to prepare and write the church constitution, which was adopted on March 23, 1919. This was perhaps the first sign of permanency that Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church in Orlando had experienced. Their efforts were soon rewarded when the entire assembly, consisting of 28 communicants and about 40 souls, ratified the Constitution on April 1, 1919. The pastor, the founders, and the congregation all knew that a permanent site was necessary. This could be done only through the erection of a sanctuary that they could call their own. A building lot committee found a small lot on West Central and Huey where to locate the first house of God. Pastor Trapp watched over his flock, saw to it that it grew, and ministered to the needy. The building committee, under his guidance, let the first contract for a stone-faced edifice. On July 24th, the cornerstone was laid. On November 13th, with a dedication service in the new building, nearly 300 people attended the morning service, with the church practically bursting at the seams. The attendance, even this early, was a witness to the fervor of the small Lutheran community. The years 1921 to 25 marked the first real growth of the church. As a matter of fact, the congregation outgrew its facility in just 4 short years. On December 28, 1921, the Reverend George Trapp was called as the first permanent pastor, after having served 6 years of dedicated and pioneering missionary service. Pastor Trapp took to his new office with a great deal of zeal. In his faithful ministry, he had organized numerous affairs to keep the congregation active and alive. His great interest in the spiritual welfare of the youth resulted in the formation of the Walther League. Pastor Trapp had promoted the first of the famous annual picnics in Herald Park. In later years, this and other similar affairs became the source of sorely needed income to save the church during the Depression days. In 1922, the church was a witness to the first baptism and funeral services. All walls resounded to the sounds of innumerable rallies, socials, and Bible study classes. In 1923 and 24, the congregation continued to grow. The parish acquired its first pump organ, and the church really began to strain under the load of its large Sunday assemblies, responding to the call of God issued by Pastor Trapp. It soon became evident that the church site would not be enough, and a new church would have to be built. On July 9, 1924, a small parcel of the parish property was sold. This was the first move to provide the capital from which to erect a new and larger church. Headed by Mr. Steinbach, a committee found and bought the property that houses today's sanctuary. This was in the days of the 1920s land boom. The old church property, which was purchased for $1,500, together with the church, which cost $6,000, was sold on August 25, 1925, for $80,000, more than 10 times its original value only 4 years prior. This was enough to buy the new property and commission the architectural firm of Corbusier, Linsky, and Foster of Cleveland to design the church, purchase a lot for the parsonage, and install the pastor in his new home on January 5, 1926. These events took place in rapid-fire sequence. Responding to the fervish tenor of the boom days, contemporaries recall that one would walk down Orange Avenue with a deed in his hand and sell it 2 or 3 times within an hour. People were anxious to capitalize on the Florida growth. Acting on the direction of the congregation, the officers petitioned on June 21, 1926, the Aid Association for Lutherans for $60,000 loan to build the new church and commission Doherty Young Construction of Orlando to erect the new sanctuary. 4 months later, on October 10th, the cornerstone was laid. On May 27th, an unprecedented event took place. Exactly 799 souls jammed the grounds to attend morning dedicatory services. That very afternoon the situation eased somewhat as another 400 worshipers attended services. As small as the basement is, and as hot as it was, the service was more than well attended. With the sanctuary going up and expenses rising, Pastor Trapp had his hands full organizing church activities and encouraging better stewardship.
Yes, he drove a 1928 Chevrolet, beat up as it was, and lots of times I and maybe some of my brothers would go with him, and he would go to these houses where parishioners were and visit them. Sometimes the people were sick. I would go in once in a while, but generally I would stay in the car, fidgety. Come on, Daddy, come on out, let's go. But that's what he did, a lot of that, and he did a lot of going downtown and parking the car and walking around and talking to people in the various stores and what have you. Even would go into a bar down on West Church Street and talk to people. I think the owner was a member, by the way.
Still time was found to organize and cook church dinners and picnics. These, incidentally, went for 50 cents for the adults and 30 cents for the children, and historians say that the food was delicious. The men of the congregation were not idle. Craftsmen helped in the building, and businessmen solicited funds and contributions from the parishioners. And almost everyone was on a penny-a-day crusade to help pay the huge 7% mortgage. But optimism and faith were high, and under pastor's guidance, the Junior Walther League found time to visit with other churches and missions in the state. The high point of these trips was visits to Tampa, the big city, where everyone would go and ride the trolley the moment the church activities were over. In the late 1920s, the Depression came, and the happy mood of the congregation turned somber. Suddenly the church was in serious financial trouble. The interest rate, which once could be carried with relative ease, became a crushing burden. The flow of pennies suddenly ground to a halt, and with it mortgage interest payments. The congregation eventually petitioned the Aid Association for Lutherans to reduce the interest rate to 3%. Even then, many parishioners believed it would be rough just to get the interest paid. Raffles, dinners, and bazaars were organized practically every week. Still, the income was not enough. Other desperate steps took place. Plans were made to refinance the church, but this was impractical. Then one sad day the church assembly heard the ultimate words, "Sell the sanctuary." This was too much for Mr. Casper. He stood up in an emotion-packed voice and shouted, "Absolutely no, under no circumstances." This seemed to break the pessimism, because from that moment on the voice of one man, through the strength and faith provided by the Lord, stopped all talk of giving up. Instead, the now famous "Save the Church" cry went up. The doors opened wider to innumerable fundraising events, picnics, and plays. All of this was done with love, devotion, and sacrifice, for pennies, nickels, and dimes. These began to amount to dollars that just managed to keep the roof over the parishioners' heads. 1932 was a crucial yet good year. With the help of God, trusting His grace to keep the church going, things took a turn for the better almost immediately. The Duda family from St. Luke's in Slavia, aware of Trinity's plight, gave $1,000 to help pay church expenses, never asking for 1 penny in return. There was also occasion for thanks on February 21, 1932, when the loan interest was reduced to 4%. 3 years later, on October 4, 1936, the Aid Association for Lutherans went even further and canceled all overdue payments. All these efforts were rewarded. Soon the church suppers became so famous that even tourists came and asked to be allowed to partake in the 50-cent feasts. The Junior Walther League was not far behind the ladies. They once gave a fish fry at Cayley and Delaney and drew about 500 people. The next 10 years, much of the energy was spent on keeping the congregation vibrant and on a steady keel. World War II came, and with it additional responsibilities for Pastor Trapp. The need for spiritual guidance and missionary work among the military brought new challenges. In fact, Pastor Trapp was known to visit the German war camps located in Orlando, ministering to the German POWs. The church again filled to overflowing. This time its confines were swollen by the ranks of men in khaki. Pastor never stopped. His parishioners were busy making the men welcome in their homes after Sunday morning services. Even the youngest pitched in. Some were known to sit behind the heavily perspiring soldiers, fending them with whatever was handy, just to bring a bit of relief to from the summer heat. With the war over and the men home, the time came again to build up the church ranks. On February 17th of 1946, Trinity's Lutheran Women's Missionary League was organized with 26 ladies signing up. Pastor Trapp, who up to this time was exceedingly active, suddenly became ill and passed away on July 10th of 1946, after 31 years of dedicated and unselfish service to God and his community. The congregation was blessed again, however, even in its grief, when Pastor Albert H.D. Bazalski was installed at Trinity 6 months later on January 19, 1947.